Welcome to Libeth. I'm glad you're here. This week we are in 17th century Japan with the Book of Five Rings, the Go-Rin no Sho of Miyamoto Musashi. Today we turn to the characters, the figures in and behind this text, and what they reveal. The Book of Five Rings has fewer named characters than any text we have read this month. It is not a text of anecdotes and exemplary figures in the way the Hagakure is. It is a text of principles. And yet the figures who inhabit it, Musashi himself above all, but also the ideal strategist the text constructs, the failed practitioners the wind scroll diagnoses, and the tradition Musashi is arguing against, are worth spending time with, because understanding who they are clarifies what the text is actually trying to do. Miyamoto Musashi is the Book of Five Rings' only real character, and he is one of the most unusual voices in the samurai literary tradition. What makes him immediate in the book is not just what he teaches, but how he claims to have earned the right to teach. He opens, in effect, with his resume, not pedigrees or temple posts, but duels tested to the point of life and death. The authority he claims is performative, practice proven in the most final way, and he states that plainly, without theatrical humility. That matters because it changes the shape of everything he writes. Principles are not proposals to be admired, they are instruments refined by experience. If you listen to how he describes the way of strategy, you hear the same voice that carves wood and checks a joint. The foreman, the craftsman, the traveler who insists that a thing must work where the earth is uneven and the roof will leak. The opening ground book compares a commander to a foreman carpenter who allocates timbers according to their defects, who knows which knots belong in a threshold and which must be left for firewood. That carpentry image is not just quaint detail. It is the structural model of Musashi's entire argument about people. A school that exhibits bright, decorative timber on the surface, a showy kata, a pleasing posture, may be dressed up like a noble house, but it will rot in the places you can't see. The carpenter, who knows which boards to hide and which to show, has hands in the reality of building. Musashi trusts the man who knows how wood behaves under load, and he trusts methods proven in the load-bearing moments of a fight. This is why his wandering life, his refusal of long-term patronage, looks less like eccentricity and more like a disciplined epistemology. Keep testing where the strain falls. Don't settle for the safe workshop of consensus. That epistemology produces an ideal strategist, who is not the same as the ideal samurai of the Hagakure or the model officer of Confucian manuals. Where the Hagakure prizes the dissolution of self into service, and the Shishinshu prizes reliable performance within institutions, Musashi wants something different. A person whose perception is uncluttered by habit, attachment, or the neat dogmas of our school. He wants someone whose perception already contains the right move, not because they consult a rule book in the heat of things, but because the rule book has been absorbed until it shapes perception itself. The water book gives us the image, water taking the shape of its receptacle, sometimes a trickle, sometimes a wild sea. The spirit must be like water, clear, adaptable, and without unnecessary outline. The void book then names the ultimate destination, not a mystical emptiness, but the clearing away of cognitive fog, the absence of distortion, so that what is present is all there is to act on. If you take that as a claim about human skill, you notice immediately that Musashi is describing the endpoint of practice, where expert intuition lies. He wants the swordsman who sees the board before the opponent has placed a piece, the firefighter who feels a floor about to ruin, the surgeon who recognizes a rare presentation at a glance. He gives the craftsman language for that endpoint. One thing, no 10,000 things. Master one truth so deeply that it becomes the key for everything else. But he doesn't let that line be a comfortable slogan. He pushes it through with specifics, with the drills of the water book, the 5 attitudes and 5 approaches to the long sword, the flowing water cut and the fire and stones cut. Because the way to make perception embody principle is not meditation alone, but repetitive, embodied apprenticeship. The wind scrolls cast of failed practitioners personifies what goes wrong when a school forgets this apprenticeship and mistakes form for living insight. Musashi catalogs the error again and again. Schools that have been built from divine shrine instruction or family tradition reduce strategy to the visible gestures of their past masters. Longsword technique is taught as an end in itself. Speed becomes a fetish. So speed at the wrong moment looks brilliant, yet fails utterly. Power becomes a ritualized strike that works in the dojo and collapses in a crowded threshold. The carpenter analogy returns. When the foreman assigns tasks without regard to the real stresses on a building, the work looks complete but collapses in winter. Musashi's critique is precise and general. Institutional transmission tends to fossilize the outputs of insight, the kata, the posture, the school reputation, while the original living capacity, the ability to perceive and adapt, withers. To see what that looks like in a human encounter, we keep returning to a duel that has become almost mythic: Ganryujima, Sasaki Kojiro, and Musashi. Kojiro, the master of the swallow's cut, represents the perfected product of a school. A single movement refined until it is a signature, a person who has shaped himself around a technique. Musashi shows us how such perfection can be brittle. He approaches the duel with behaviors that read as strategic probes more than theatrical gestures. A late arrival, a crude wooden sword carved on the way, an air that unsettles. Each of those moves is not merely bravado. They are instruments for changing the moment. Kojiro had trained to meet a certain tempo and posture. Musashi changed the tempo of the encounter, so the swallow's cut lost its purchase. The duel compresses Musashi's argument into a narrative. The technique is exquisite, but it lives only inside the assumed scenario that produced it. Remove the scenario, and the technique reveals its limits. That is the point he returns to again and again in the Wind Book and elsewhere. What your school perfected may be the very thing that blinds you. If the failed practitioner is an instructive negative, Musashi spends the rest of the book showing how to build the positive. He gives a dense toolkit for cultivating perception and timing, because timing, he insists, is everything. Timing is in dancing and in stepping, in bows and guns, in the rise and fall of houses and fortunes. He divides the ways you can take the initiative into 3 precise methods: Ken no Sen, Tai no Sen, and Tai Tai no Sen, because taking the lead in combat is not a general virtue, but a set of concrete choices about timing and spirit. Ken no Sen is attacking to forestall, the active application of reserve. Tai no Sen is meeting force with an apparent weakness and striking when the enemy relaxes. Tai Tai no Sen is accompanying the enemy's motion and beating him within it. Those are not abstractions. They are taxonomies of how choice and timing meet in the hand and the knee. Musashi does not let us leave them as rules. He demands training until timing becomes a part of the body's cadence. He pairs those timing doctrines with vivid behavioral maxims that read like recorded flashes of practice. Hold down a pillow, Don't let an enemy's head rise into initiative. Crossing at a ford, pick the place to commit where your odds turn. Tread down the sword. Strike in the very moment of the enemy's opening so he cannot renew his attack. Each image carries its own internal logic. Holding down a pillow is defensive form that becomes offensive because it denies the opponent alternatives. Crossing at a ford is not cowardice, but calculation. Choosing the channel where you can use advantage. Treading down the sword is about closure, about converting a single hit into a denied second chance. Because Musashi's world is lethal, these are not theoretical. They are survival tools, and he expects the reader to carry them into drills and duels until the distinctions vanish into habit. This is why he insists on certain paradoxes. No design, no conception is the cut where the body, spirit, and hands become one, accelerating without premeditation. It sounds mystical, but he grounds it in practice. You cultivate the state by practicing the 5 attitudes, by training your grip so the thumb and forefinger float while the last 2 fingers hold, by adopting a gaze that is broad rather than obsessively narrow. The water book's prescriptions for posture, and the 5 approaches to the long sword, middle attitude confronting the face, upper attacking as the enemy comes, lower scooping up, left and right strategic adjustments are not ornamental. They are scaffolding to reach that no-design state. Musashi's language moves from the tactile to the metaphysical because his aim is to make the gap between decision and movement disappear. The void, then, is simply the absence of anything between perception and action. It is not an empty mystical silence, but the unclogged highway of judgment. He also gives us techniques with names that feel almost cinematic because they ask you to feel a body in contact. The glue and lacquer emulsion body. Cling to the opponent so there is no gap. The Chinese monkey's body. Do not stretch the arms outward. Get in quickly. The body in place of the long sword. Use your body to make the strike when the blade cannot travel. These strategies sound like a manual, and they are, but they also show the ethical shape of Musashi's realism. The proper use of technique is the one that fits the messy, contingent places where fights actually happen, thresholds, verandas, swampy ground, and the proper teacher is the one who prepares you for that mess. The Book of 5 Rings also names institutional blindness as a character. The various schools, the shrine-born dojos, the family lineages, the flamboyant perfumers, are persons in the narrative. They persist because they can be taught, sold, named. Musashi treats them as competitors in truth claims and argues they have become merchants of surface. He points out, almost clinically, where those schools go wrong. They teach speed as a virtue rather than rhythm. They fix attention on the enemy's blade or the hands instead of the heart of the opponent's spirit. They make the visible attitude the whole of the way. That critique is not an attack on technique. He admits many techniques are good. The critique is epistemological. Institutions tend to make method the endpoint rather than the rehearsal for perceptual skill. Which is why his doctrine of Nito Ikai Ryu, 1 school, 2 swords, is both practical and philosophical. He insists warriors should practice with both swords from the start, training to use a companion sword in confined spaces and a long sword more broadly. It's not romanticism about double weapons. It's a lesson in adaptability. Carrying 2 swords is a material fact of the world of the warrior, and his point is moral. When you face the contingency of actual ground, you must not die with a weapon undrawn because you preferred an aesthetic of mastery over a readiness to live. The 2 swords are a visual expression of his recurring maxim: be ready in multiple registers. Let no preference blind you to the moment. Musashi's prescriptions are also modestly social. He writes that the way of strategy is not merely personal, it has civic implications. The carpenter's foreman and the military commander share principles. Know the materials, assign tasks to fit ability, encourage morale, avoid unreasonable demands. Strategy scaled up becomes administration. Lead many by knowing them. The commander knows the troops, he writes, because the interval between a shrewd general and a clumsy ruler is often the difference between an arranged set of timbers and a collapsed roof. In that tone, his famous "one man can become 10,000" aphorism is not bravado about individual heroics. It's an argument about scalability. The rooted perception of a practiced leader makes small units act like many, and many like a single coherent will. At the end of the sequence, Musashi gives practical moral instructions that could be misread as austere checklisting if you missed their logic. Do not think dishonestly. The way is in training. Know many arts, distinguish gain and loss, develop intuitive judgment, perceive what cannot be seen, pay attention to trifles, and do nothing which is of no use. Those lines are not platitudes. They are diagnostic criteria for a mind that resists institutional capture. The call to perceive what cannot be seen is not esoteric. It is the habit of reading timing, background rhythm, and the enemy's collapsing spirit. The call to pay attention to trifles is not pedantry. It is a recognition that the grain of the wood, the crease in the opponent's sleeve, the slightly off beat of his breath, are the signals that make perception usable. Finally, the human Musashi who signs at the end of the book, Shinmen Musashi, noting time and place like a carpenter marking a build, remains not a thoroughly documented social actor, but an authorial presence that refuses the usual bases of authority. His authority is craft and testing. The book's closing image, the body of a rock, is not an exaltation of stoicism. It is a statement of mastery. Train so deeply that external things cannot touch you, so that the moment suddenly contains its correct response without hesitancy. That image carries backward to everything he has said about timing, about cutting in one timing, about the 3 methods to forestall the enemy, about renewing your rhythm when you are deadlocked. Musashi's writing is a conversation with practice. The characters are the human forms that practice takes when preserved or when ossified. The book insists you study both until the difference is visible in your reactions. If you listen to the Book of 5 Rings this way, the figures in it become an argument rather than a gallery. Musashi, the practical loner, the wanderer who refuses patronage, teaches an ideal strategist who is at once carpenter, commander, and water. The failed practitioners are warnings about the life of institutions that sell polish while losing functionality. The schools are characters because their habits narrate ways the human mind gets tricked into believing its own fictions. And the duels and the named techniques, the flowing water cut, the red leaves cut, the glue and lacquer emulsion body, are not just exotic notes. They are experiments in the logic of perception, each one worked through until you can see what fails if you import a formal beauty into a situation that needs a different kind of seeing. So when you read Musashi, you don't just encounter a manual for killing or a piece of samurai showmanship. You meet a practical epistemologist who chose to test ideas by threats that could not be retried. That choice makes his voice odd in the samurai literary landscape, but it also makes his lessons oddly portable. They speak to any craft where institutions tend to congeal method into a product and forget the lived capacity that generated the method. He insists, again and again, in image and exercise, that what we call mastery is not the accretion of named techniques, but the cultivation of timing, perception, and the freedom to act without consulting doctrine in the heat of the moment. If you want to know what kind of person Musashi thought you ought to become, don't seek a statue. Seek the carpenter who knows which wood to show and which to hide, who sharpens his tools every day, and who never stops checking the join under load because he knows that's where truth reveals itself. That's all for today on Libeth. Tomorrow we close the week with the ideas, the themes underneath the Book of 5 Rings, and what they leave us with. If you want to follow the whole journey, subscribe, a new book every week.